What's happening, folks? We're back with the next piece in our Classical Days journey, day 4. Thank you to those following along. And we're going to listen to a work by Sergei Prokofiev, a 20th century Soviet composer who, in the mid 1930s, wrote a ballet based on Romeo and Juliet, obviously the Shakespeare play. Though I don't think it had its first performance until 1940, which I think was at least in part because Soviet censors and music institutions considered it too bourgeoisie and required Prokofiev to rewrite parts of it to fit more with state ideology. So, obviously, an indication of the type of challenging musical environment that Prokofiev and other Soviet composers worked within. Nevertheless, this piece is maybe the most famous from the entire score to the ballet, and I think these days the full ballet is not often performed. I could be wrong, but my understanding and my experience, having gone to many classical performances over the years and having heard parts of Prokofiev's Romeo and Juliet performed live, I think more often it is done in suites or selections from the larger incidental music score and then performed without the actual stage performance, just the music itself. And indeed, this CD is Prokofiev Romeo and Juliet highlights, so it is very much indicative of, again, I think the way that the music from the ballet is now in the 21st century, and I think this is probably from the 20th century. I'm guessing the CD is from the 90s. Yeah, I think it's 1999, 1998. It is very small print. In any case, yes, this piece is called the Montagues and Capulets, and it's another classical work that is heard in the incredible show Nodame Cantabile. So once again, I'll put my link, or the link to my watch-along of Nodame, in the description here, and even if you've never seen a minute of Japanese television drama in your life, if you do like classical music, I highly encourage you to check it out, and I'll leave it at that. Nevertheless, this is, as I said, called Montagues and Capulets, probably the most famous piece from the entire score of Romeo and Juliet, and it speaks to the familial rivalry and indeed hatred between the Montagues, of which Romeo is a part, and the Capulets, from which Juliet springs, and is thus indicative of the tension and peril that exists on the streets of Verona during the play, and of course why Romeo and Juliet's star-crossed love and marriage doesn't work out by the end, aided of course by Romeo's slaying of Tybalt after Tybalt slays Mercutio, and as Mercutio says with one of his dying breaths, a plague of both your houses. And it is this inter-house friction and violence that is, of course, the main prohibitive factor preventing the love that springs forth for Romeo and Juliet from ever becoming permanent and long-lasting. So, yes, as the second half of the play spirals toward a perfectly tragic ending, this piece really captures that dynamic and the way these two houses lord over the city of Verona and make it unbearable for many of the people who live there. So, let's give it a listen. This is Sergei Prokofiev and Montagues and Capulets from his Romeo and Juliet ballet as performed by the Slovak State Philharmonic Orchestra and conducted by Andrew Magrelia. Yes, Andrew Magrelia. Powerful, incredible, and if you've seen Nodame, as I know Michaela has, and maybe some other of you have seen without commenting over on my Patreon, you can't help but think of Stresemann Sensei, who is an incredible character, and yes, when he shows up, this piece often plays, though not that section where it does the main dramatic melody with saxophone and clarinet. I think it's certainly a sax to start, and then I think it goes into a clarinet. But yes, like, it gives a different feeling in that moment. Now, it follows a lighter, more tender section, which again, I think you can read as like, the older members of the Montague and Capulet families are just sort of stuck in their hatred of each other, their rivalry, their feud, if you will. And then that lighter, sort of elegant section maybe speaks to the way that Romeo and Juliet could have changed that, if only their families would have allowed them to marry in public rather than in secret, which of course is why Romeo doesn't want to fight Tybalt on the street, because it's technically now like his brother-in-law, but because Mercutio doesn't know that, and he's sort of mad that Romeo doesn't step up, he challenges Mercutio, or rather Tybalt, to a fight. Romeo tries to intervene, but that allows Tybalt to stab underneath his arm and kill Mercutio, which again then sets off a cascading series of events resulting in the death of both Romeo and Juliet and great tragedy. But yes, I feel like that lighter section maybe suggests that Romeo and Juliet could have changed things, and they could have had a sweet resolution to this long-running feud, but it didn't turn out that way. It is a Shakespearean tragedy, and those don't tend to end well. So yes, I love the way that section following the lighter section suddenly gives it almost like this jazzy feel, which you can tell it's a 20th century piece. Like, I don't think that's a section you would hear if this was like the mid-19th century. A mid-20th century, the saxophone, and again the clarinet sort of following it in a light and jazzy way, or a almost funky jazzy way. It definitely has a different flavor. Now that it then goes back into the normal articulation of that heavy, like marching type feel, with again little drum rolls from the snare, and that sense of doom, or at least dark weight and drama that characterizes the majority of the tune. So yes, I love the tune overall. I love that little section after the slow part, and I think it is indicative of the quality music. Now, it's probably my favorite piece, but there's 14 selections on here culled from the larger score. So over time, I'm gonna, this will probably be the only piece I do during classical days from Prokofiev, but over time we have 13 more selections from his Romeo and Juliet ballet that we can go through. So I hope you were here for the regular classical reactions as well. Let me know what you think, and I will see you for the next piece.